Perhaps you do this too, scoffing at the Confederate soldiers for being so blind to the obvious issue of the time, slavery. Most people who lived in the Confederate States of America didn't hold slaves, and while certainly a very racist society, a freed slave had better luck finding a job in the South than in the North. The extreme proprietarian ideology of the Confederacy that would uphold the ownership of slaves also upheld the legitimacy of the freed slave. The states without slavery tended more toward white nationalism. The notion that the Confederacy harbored more aggregate racial prejudice than the Union stems from the fact that there were more black people in the South and thus more opportunities for the extant prejudices to manifest. Now, following the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves, which was viewed as illegitimate by the Confederacy and led to a black racial voting bloc, racial hatred came to the fore. And of course the black population voted reliably Republican at the time, which was the party of big government and big business. Back then, people were smart enough to recognize that big business loves big government and that regulations are simply barriers to entry. But by establishing mandatory 12-year education camps, either run or approved by the state had managed to break this connection in the mind of the public and pose as protectors against free market robber barons. But I digress. How could a Confederate soldier fight for a polity that upheld slavery? The type of mind that could do such a thing and then imagine they were fighting for liberty is one that most today cannot conjure. But it should be extremely easy to conjure when you analyze your own view of people in third world countries. That is, people recognize that U.S. policies prop up totalitarians and cause damage to those folks in Africa. 80.5% of the sub-Saharan African population was living on less than $2.50 per day. And there was approximately 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa as of when I wrote this book. The median income for blacks in the U.S. is $34,218 per year. U.S. blacks have an extremely wealthy and privileged population with high levels of education. While they may have something to complain about, it is definitely not that they lack income or opportunity compared to everyone else. Perhaps compared to what they would have on a free market, but not compared to everyone else today. Right. And if one is concerned about fellow humans, then the last place they should look is in America. Even the underprivileged populations in America. But people still think the plight of American blacks is worth mentioning because of political barriers. The Confederates didn't think much of the plight of slaves because they were slaves, nor do Americans think much of the plight of Africans because they are Africans. If you want to see how the Confederate soldier could do what he did, just look in the mirror, because odds are you do the same thing. Now, Sister Bleeding Heart, with all of your compassion, please don't turn to the state. The very bugaboo that created the political barriers, which are primarily barriers of the mind, is not what will solve the world's problems. Pointing guns in certain directions in an attempt to transfer resources simply causes production to contract among both the taxed and those who receive goods. If you care about the third world, you will advocate two things. 1, open borders. 2, free trade. On the surface, this may appear to lead to rife exploitation, but let me say that money represents goods, and if the entire world labor market is integrated into a universal structure of production, more things will be produced, and those things will be bought with whatever wages are paid. Wages will crash, to be sure, but so will prices. In the long run, i.e. 50 to 100 years, we would all be better off if this was implemented. Though in the short run, the result would be a titanic transfer of capital to the third world, and in effect a giant transfer of wealth to the, quote, third world, close quote. Think high pressure to low pressure. Capital is attracted to the relatively undercapitalized areas. Opening the borders would be like opening a giant vacuum seal, sucking the wealth from the first world to the third, though eventually resulting in a higher amount of wealth for all as the wealth relatively equalizes. If you are unwilling to support freedom, and you wish to use the guns of the state to keep the Africans, South and Southeast Asians and South Americans locked out so that you can live a life of comfort, well then please don't blather about having compassion or imagine that you are any better than a Confederate soldier.